Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my bill, H.R. 2792, the Small Entity Update Act. Mr. Speaker, the slate of bills that we are considering today are the culmination of 4 hearings that the Capital Markets Subcommittee, which I have the honor and privilege of chairing, has held this year, where we heard from over a dozen witnesses, including founders of private and public companies, investors, former SEC commissioners, security law practitioners, and even one of the authors of the IPO-related provisions of the Jobs Act. All of these bills play a vital role in expanding investment opportunities for all Americans, improving access to capital for small businesses, and strengthening our public markets. 11 years ago, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, or Jobs Act of 2012, was enacted into law by a divided Congress with the intention of increasing access to capital for small businesses and entrepreneurs in the United States. The purpose of the Jobs Act was to provide greater opportunities for small business owners and entrepreneurs to grow their companies and create jobs in their communities. Despite the successes of the Jobs Act, there are still significant regulatory barriers that impede the growth of small businesses and hinder the competitiveness of job growth in the United States. Small businesses, Mr. Speaker, make up 99% of all enterprises and employ almost half of the United States workforce and are disproportionately affected by these barriers. These companies represent the engine of our economy and are far too often subject to one-size-fits-all regulation. The lack of access to capital makes it challenging for small business owners to grow and expand their companies, which can limit job creation and economic growth. That is why I introduced the Small Entity Update Act. This bipartisan bill would direct the SEC to conduct a study followed by a rulemaking that is consistent with the results of such study every 5 years. This study would focus on defining the terms of small entity under the Regulatory Flexibility Act. The regulations often impose disproportionate burdens on startups and small businesses and other small entities. Small entities simply can't afford the number of lawyers and regulatory experts that large multinational firms can to comply with every regulation while still being able to afford the cost of doing business. The government cannot and should not treat a small startup in my hometown of Baldwin, Missouri, with 7 employees as it would a Fortune 500 company. But the reality is that the size of companies and the underlying makeup of market forces behind them change over time, which is why my bill requires the SEC to reevaluate their small business definition every 5 years. Because what makes sense for companies today in terms of regulatory compliance may not in 5 years. My bill addresses longstanding concerns that numerous SEC rules do not appropriately balance the SEC's mandates to protect investors and facilitate capital formation. Studying and revising these definitions will result in a better understanding of regulatory costs on small entities and ensure that the SEC modernizes its criteria for defining them. In order for our economy to thrive, Mr. Speaker, Congress and regulators must ensure that any policies enacted keep in mind any impacts that would have on our millions of small businesses. H.R. 2792 will lead to a more targeted regulatory framework for these entities and help make the American dream a reality for all entrepreneurs. I want to thank Mr. Himes, Mr. Torres, Mr. Scott, and Mr. Caston for their bipartisan support of this impactful legislation and urge all my colleagues to vote for this bill. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.